I am Evelyn Zumaya, and I am the author of Affairs Valentino. The following excerpt will be read from Chapter 12, Hoping to be Kindly Remembered. I'll begin on page 292. Rudy and George shared a passionate interest in boxing, and they were not only active participants in the sport, but avid fans. One of George's first orders of business upon his arrival in Los Angeles was the purchase of a block of 8 seats in the American Legion Arena. There, without exception, every Friday night, the Valentinos and the Ullmans were seated ringside. Usually decked out in a beret, a pair of knickers, and a tweed sports coat, Rudy cheered in Italian if an Italian pugilist was in the ring, and in English if the boxer was American. On a few occasions he cheered in Spanish, along with actress Lupe Velez, for the American Legion's Mexican boxers. The crowd always knew when Rudy was in the stadium. He was loud, especially after he'd had a few drinks. It became one of the most demanding aspects of George's job during the fall of 1924, to prevent the press from reporting any news of Rudy's increasingly rowdier public indiscretions. George continued to issue his stock press releases and censor all copy written about Rudy before it was released to fan magazines. He did so in a calculated effort to portray Rudy as having no more than a glass of wine with dinner and behaving at home and in public as a veritable Boy Scout. In fact, a loyal fleet of bootleggers provided Rudy with cases of top-shelf liquor, and after his return to Los Angeles, he was often inebriated. He drank quantities of liquor far more often than he had in New York, and to make matters worse, he was becoming a disagreeable drinker. This disturbing trend presented such problems for George, he retained 3 public relations men with powerful connections with the press and the police. He placed these men permanently on the payroll. Rudy's fans knew nothing of his drunken behavior or the efforts of the whitewash team keeping the distressing facts from his public. One of these harrowing incidents occurred after Rudy announced to George, Bea, and Natasha that he was driving them all to San Diego for dinner at the beachside resort, the Coronado Hotel. The 4 friends left Los Angeles on the 3-hour road trip traveling south along the Pacific Coast Highway in Rudy's Voisin Roadster. But once inside the Coronado Hotel's restaurant, Rudy was recognized, and women began swarming around him. George diplomatically tried to move the women along. Rudy was not in a magnanimous mood, waved his arm in the air in defiance, and demanded loudly that he be left to his dinner. It was not long before the situation became intolerable, and Rudy began elbowing his way through the persistent fans, storming out of the restaurant and heading for the Voisin. With George, Bea, and Natasha barely seated in the car, Rudy hit the accelerator and careened onto the highway to drive further south to Tijuana, Mexico. Ignoring George's protests, he bore down on the road and insisted they spend the night gambling in the casino. George demanded to take the wheel, as he knew Rudy had already had far too many shots of whiskey from the flask he kept in his coat pocket. Rudy would hear none of it. A short while later, Rudy stood before a grand roulette wheel in a Tijuana casino, where he ordered round after round of Scotch whiskey. He quickly gambled away a small fortune, and with each loss he increased his bet and became more belligerent. Natasha and George's shushing only incited him to bark louder at everyone. When the casino security demanded he shut up or they would summon the local police, Rudy staggered a few steps and bellowed, "To hell with the Mexican police." A Mexican police officer just happened to be in the casino at the time, but was thankfully out of earshot. But a casino security guard had heard Rudy's rant and waved the police officer over to the gaming table. When the officer heard how Rudy had just damned him to hell, he sidled closer to Rudy and asked him in broken English, "What did you say?" By then George had a tight grip on Rudy's arm and leaned in to whisper into his ear, "For God's sake, Rudy, say Viva the Mexican police." Rudy flashed a withering look of disgust at the security guard, wrenched his arm from George's grasp, and took another staggering step of defiance in the police officer's direction. Recognizing the impending fisticuffs, George grabbed Rudy, spun him around, and slugged him full force in the jaw. His fist delivered enough of a blast to end Rudy's drunken rant and prevented the police officer from arresting him on the spot. Before Rudy knew what had hit him, George was shuffling him to a nearby table, while Natasha rushed to retrieve a cup of coffee for her dazed husband. Within the next few minutes, Rudy gulped down a cup of coffee and was scuttled out of the casino towards the Vasson. Unfortunately, before George managed to shove him out the nearest exit, Rudy was squarely recognized. He put up no further fight when George refused to allow him to drive the return trip to Los Angeles. During the wee hours of that night, George and his 3 publicity men made their calls and managed to prevent any mention of the hubbub in Tijuana from appearing in the morning papers. And by the following morning, Rudy had once again sobered up, was racked with remorse, and making his apologies to anyone who would listen. Thankfully for George, generating positive press for Rudy was always an easier feat. Just before Christmas that year, he staged an elaborately coordinated press event in honor of barber Ellis G. Bond's public shaving of Rudy's infamous goatee. Soon after this highly publicized shave, Rudy was seized by more than his usual near-paralyzing paranoia, and he became convinced his hair was falling out. He could not be persuaded to the contrary, and steadfastly believed the master barbers of America had zapped his famous head with a curse. In an effort to ward off the barber's bad mojo, he began carrying amulets in order to toupee.